What's up, guys? This is Matt. We're back with another round of the bodybuilding educational series. I've had a little bit of a hiatus for the last few weeks between me going to the New York Pro and then traveling after New York Pro, then coming back for our grand opening event, which was awesome. Those of you guys that came, supported from afar, we appreciate all you. It was just a really encouraging, rewarding weekend for all of us, and just like a culmination of a lot of hard work that came together. So I was super just fortunate and thankful to be here. I had some friends that were able to come down for it, which meant a lot to me. And then on the back end of that, the boys have now finished their school year for the year. So we took some time with them for a few days and then just kind of getting back into the flow of work. So I've been very much looking forward to this episode talking about peaking. And going into this, I was talking to Mook today about just like a little bit of a different approach to how I want to present this material today. So far, this is typically like a Q&A series. We're going to finish today with questions specifically to peaking. But what I want to do is I really just want to kind of go through my process with you guys, lay out my process so that way you guys can understand. And then rather than, having to jump back and forth between different phases and maybe missing some communication via questions, I'm just going to kind of lay it out in detail for you. And then we'll use these questions that you guys have submitted at the end to either cover things that I might have missed, maybe a different approach or a different thought process of something I said. So we're going to cover it all, but I wanted to go into like the final week, and I want to start with like 2 weeks out. Really, for me, peaking is all about just solidifying the variables that matter the absolute most, and then getting rid of variables that no longer need to be there. So for me, this comes down to a few things and just really refining what the individual is doing at the 2 week out mark. Typically what I like to do is I like to reduce a lot of variables that I don't feel need to be there anymore. A couple of those are artificial sweeteners. So I remove all artificial sweeteners. I typically like to remove all sauces. That being said, sodium consistency is a big thing for me. So if you remove sauces, or if I ask you to remove sauces, but yet that sauce also has a lot of sodium, then I would want you to put that ratio of sodium back in via sea salt and then remove the sauce. So that's another one. And then supplementation, from a supplementation perspective, I really want to make sure that we're getting nutrients in, specific ingredients in that we might be lacking. A few of those might be magnesium, immune support, via vitamin C, via B complex, things of that nature, just to make sure that your immune system is strong. Because realistically speaking, you've been depleted for a long time. You potentially have some travel coming up. There's also like a diuresis effect to vitamin C, but I just really want to make sure that the immune system's strong, that we're reducing variables that I don't feel like need to be intact for a final week. And then just solidifying each variable that I feel is super important. So in terms of those artificial sweeteners, some of you guys might be asking, well, what about things like EAAs, whey protein? Yes, I typically remove all those as well. I don't like to use foods in the final 2 weeks that I'm not going to be using in the final 2 days. So I typically don't like to load people on whey isolate. Again, because the artificial sweeteners, it's just a processed protein source. I'd rather use whole food. So I just take that out of the equation. Amino acids, if you still want to supplement with amino acids, especially for like fasted cardio, things of that nature, I would just go to an unsweetened version. Obviously it doesn't taste great, but that's kind of how you can bridge that gap. Or I think for the last 2 weeks, you'll be okay without that. But if you guys have questions about that, that's how I'd approach that. So then going into the actual okay, Matt, well, when do you start to really change things? What I do around that 2 week output period, after I remove the variables, I really make sure that we solidify water intake and make sure that's set and consistent throughout the day. And with the water intake, whether it might be 5 liters, 6 liters, 7 liters, I want to make sure that how they're consuming the water throughout the day is also consistent. So let's say, for example's sake, you're getting 30 ounces of water before you do your morning cardio, right when you wake up, making sure that you're hydrated going into that cardio. That to me is super important. And then just splitting the ratio of that 7 liters throughout the day, let's say 8 to 10 ounces with each meal, and then your remaining allotment of water consistently consumed between meals. I think for you, the athlete, mentally, the more set variables you have where it's just everything is textbook, your body's going to start to respond better. And then your ability to then give feedback to your coach is also going to be super helpful. So solidify that water, remove unadded variables. And then another big factor for me, some people might agree with this, some people might disagree with this. I feel like that it's a tool that should be very heavily considered, is the scale. And the reason why is because I'm not with all these athletes in person, but I feel like the scale is a valuable tool for feedback, because as you peak somebody, when you peak somebody properly and you're reducing water intake from that they're ingesting, and then also ideally you're getting rid of excess water on the body, you should see a correlation to how the scale weight goes down. So, around that 10, 8, 7 day mark out, days out mark, what I like to do is I like to start seeing their weight in the morning, and then I like to see their weight either before their last meal or at bed. And then what I'm trying to assess there is how much they're then flushing overnight. And that rate of flushing is super important for me, because once you know that, then you can start to add in other variables of, okay, now I'm going to add in a little bit more carbs. I'm going to start to reduce and pull back on energy output via cardio. And then how these things start to manipulate the water balance. Is it aiding in lessening the water balance? If by reducing cardio and adding carbs, are we increasing, maybe potentially holding more water? So I just like to know on a day-to-day basis what that trend is of morning weight upon waking, how the trend goes throughout the day, how much weight their fluctuation goes up at night, and then how much they're clearing throughout the night. Another thing, as you start to reduce your energy output, as you start to pull back on training volume, as you start to pull back on training intensity, there's several things that you could honestly just reduce inflammation. So let's say if that individual, when you start to really track, if they're trending up 5 pounds a day, but then let's say their rate of loss overnight is 7, that tells me that, one, their excretion of water is in a good spot. They might be starting to drop inflammation, and that their body's really starting to kind of change into that pattern of lessening water on the body to give yourself a more transparent, clear, defined look come show day. So for me, the first variable I always touch and monitor before I do anything else is always going to be water. And then after water, the second variable that I consider is, let's just say, for lack of a better word, the reduction of inflammation. So this is going to come down to starting to pull back slightly on cardio. And then it's going to start to pull back slightly on effort applied within training. I am a huge proponent and believer in keeping as many variables the same as possible. And within that being said, also keeping your body in a consistent rhythm. But I do think in order to display your best look on stage, you have to start pulling back on variables that could be potentially increasing inflammation within the body and or just causing more stress. So another key focus or component to me, especially going into that final week, is how the individual is sleeping and how much sleep they're getting every night. So in a typical, and I probably talked about this in the past, but in a typical cardio contest prep environment, I really prefer to split the 3 up. So I'm going to do cardio in the morning. Ideally, if the athlete can, if their schedule allows for it to, they'll train midday, mid-afternoon, evening. They'll at least get another meal in, and then they'll do cardio at night. But going into that final week, I would like to at least reduce the amount of individual sessions through the day. So I'm either going to pull back on cardio minutes throughout the day, or I'm going to at least add that PM session back post-workout. So that way, once they're done with their post-workout training or their workout, and then they do their cardio, then they're done for the day. So that way they can start to really get more into that rest mode in the evening, really unwind, settle. And then that too, I think oftentimes will help your body calm down, help your mind calm down, help drop cortisol, help drop inflammation, which is all part of the goal going into the final few days. Okay, so reducing water or solidifying variables, getting sodium set, reducing water, finding means to reduce inflammation, and then we kind of get into the fun part of carb manipulation, fat manipulation, sodium manipulation, which I do very little of. And then, the final potential, diuretic use or extreme water manipulation towards the end. So for me, let's say most often with most of my guys, I like to give like the final 3 days of really starting to change and manipulate food. And really what I like to do, and I know I talked about this in the past in terms of our refeed episode, every time you have a refeed and the foods that you use during that refeed, which is why I addressed the whey protein isolate earlier, I like to keep those foods as consistent as possible from every refeed going into the final week, so that way you have a snapshot of their response. Let's say for an individual, I'm going to start slowly increasing their food 3 days out. And when I say slowly, my thought process right off the bat isn't always going to be about fullness. It's going to be about just freshening up the body overall and then continuing this loss and drop of inflammation going into the show. So that first day of refeed, I might bring that person up to anywhere from 60 to 80% of their normal high day diet 3 days out. Okay, so again, most often I'm keeping water the same. So water hasn't been touched. Let's say water is at 7 liters. And then from their base diet, I'm going to bring their most times their carbs and their fats up 60 to 80%, relative to what it was on their base high day. All right. And then I'm going to see how they respond in that environment. Again, I'm still checking AM weight. I'm still checking PM weight. I'm checking their pictures in the morning. I'm often getting around either mid-afternoon or post-workout, and then another round in the evening, and I'm assessing the changes and differences between those pictures. So really the goal of the first day for me is just to gauge the initial response with set water, and then from the set water, how much food have I added and what type of response are we getting from that? And are we getting a weight scale response? Is the scale actually going down more? As we're starting to feed them up, are they actually starting to drop more weight? Are they holding more weight? Is their post-workout weight relative to yesterday higher or lower? These are all things that I consider because, again, to me, it's tools. Obviously, the most important tool is your experience and your eye and judging the individual, but these other things can also give you cues in terms of what's truly important, how to look at them, and then continue to make decisions from there. So from there, let's go to 2 days out. All right, so now 2 days out, I'm going to do more of a push and pull in terms of I'm going to start to reduce water more. I'm still keeping water intact, not fully removing it. And then I'm going to start to pull more on the carbs based off of how they responded the previous day. So let's say, for example's sake here, I bring the water from 7 liters a day on 3 days out to now 5 liters. And then on the 3-day out diet, I basically increase that from baseline closer to their refeed day at about a 60 to 80% increase. Not 100% of their high day, but about 60 to 80% of what it was. And then 2 days out, let's say I'll toggle the water back to 4.5 liters for the day. Still keeping very specific increments of how I'm giving that person water. Typically 2 days out for most individuals, either their first true day off of cardio or their last day on cardio in the morning, and that's at a reduced workload. So rather than 30 minutes of cardio at 100%, I might bring it down to 20 minutes of cardio at 80%. Okay, so I'm still keeping the body in the rhythm, but again, with the goal of reducing inflammation, keeping the body flowing, potentially getting that initial water shift first thing in the morning. Again, a rhythm that they're used to, and then we'll go into feeding. That second day, the feeding is very specific based off of how they responded the previous day. So if they woke up 2 days out looking better than 3 days out, we fed them more food, they maybe even dropped a little bit more inflammation, I'm going to then start to push the food up even more. At this day, I would say most often I'm anywhere between 85% of their normal high day to 105 to 110% of their normal high day. One variable that I don't really reduce a lot during a refeed is the protein intake. I might reduce it maybe like 20 grams scale weight per meal. But starting 2 days out, I'm going to start to bring the protein intake down because obviously the goal is more so satiety from the protein, but getting the carbs and fats in from a loading perspective. So hypothetically, if somebody is taking in 224 grams of protein per meal, I might pull this down to like 175. But then I am titrating the fats and the carbs up. And then as I noted earlier, I'm also bringing the water down. Okay. So again, I am at 2 days out, I am not touching sodium at all. The main variables that we're playing with here are water, starting to reduce the water, and then increasing the food. Again, carbohydrates and fats, reducing the protein, and then seeing again how they respond in that environment. So I'm not like trying to overshoot it. I'm just really trying to look at the difference because for me, the goal of a refeed is super saturation, get their body back in a positive place, get them fed, allow the training to be beneficial in a shorter time frame, and it's not so much cosmetic. Towards the end, in a peak, the goal and focus should always primarily be about the cosmetic. And then secondary to that, I do care about how they're feeling. I want them feeling stronger during their posing. But yet that still is a secondary component to me other than just the cosmetic look the final day. So 2 days out, going into that evening, and this is, again, me being fully transparent with you guys. When it comes to diuretic usage, I prefer to use, the only thing that I use is a diazide. And I prefer to use very, very micro doses of diazide, and I start to implement that 2 days out. The reason why is because when it comes to diuretic usage, I would prefer to use a little bit further away from the show, and that gives you more time to correct if something happens, than just kind of bank on it going into the show, and then you either haven't used enough or you've used too much and you wake up the morning of the show and it's too late of a situation to try to correct the issue. So most often, again, never allow like a predetermined plan to dictate what you're seeing in front of your eyes. But I would put a little bit, if you want to use any, if we're talking about something like this, like a diuretic, in the night before, 2 days out, so that way you can wake up 1 day out and see exactly where that individual is at. Did it overpull? Did it underpull? How did the look change? Did it improve from 2 days out to 1 day out? Did it get better? Did it get worse? Like, ask yourself all these questions. Are they drier, but are they flatter? Are they sharper? Are they flatter? You need to be able to assess all this. And then again, this is where it's so important, because let's say if the last 3 days, their rate of loss overnight is 7 pounds, and then you put a eighth of a diazide in this individual, then it might be that they cleared 9 pounds. So off of an eighth of a diazide, with adding food, with reducing water, you pulled an extra 2 pounds off of that person through the reduction of water and adding the diazide in. And diazide, for those of you guys that might not know, it's trimetrazine and then hydrochlorothiazide, 2 of those combined. The most common form in America is a 37.5 and a 25 milligram tablet combined. And that to me is really all I like to do when it comes to that type of usage. So now going into 1 day out, this is obviously the day where things are very crucial, where I really try to trust my eye as much as I can. And again, it's just toggling these variables. 1 day out, the one change that I make 1 day out that I haven't made so far is, as I know that the water volume is decreasing, whether that's through just continuing to pull water or through diuretic usage, I'm going to slowly start to titrate up sodium, but slowly. So really what I like to do is, on 1 day out, have a gauge of when that individual is going to actually step on stage for prejudging. Are they going to step on stage at 9 a.m.? Are they going to step on stage at noon? Is it going to be 3 p.m.? So based off of, the Friday morning or the Saturday show, if we're 36 hours out from stage, that will kind of dictate when I start to put sodium in greater amounts, or when I hold it and just keep it consistent. So that's one variable that I play with. Obviously 1 day out, as long as the look from 2 days out to 1 day out continue to improve, we're still seeking to get that individual drier. I'm going to manipulate the water even more. And I really do, most often, I pull pretty hard on the water going into that final day. So it might be a reduction of, let's say we're going from 4.5 liters to, now I'm going to specifically tell you how much water I want you drinking with each meal, in between each meal. It could be as much as 6 to 10 ounces between and with each meal. It could be as little as 4 ounces with a meal, nothing else. All right. So that's one variable that I think is highly individual and independent on the day before a show. For example, 2 of my guys, Sean Clarita, he can do very well, and he can stay very hard and full on very small amounts of water. Brett Wilkin, he has that round, bubbly look, but he needs more water to maintain and achieve that look, whereas Sean, you literally can dry him up as much as possible, and the fullness genetically still stays. So again, it's about knowing who your athlete is and knowing what to do with that athlete at the crucial moments. Food wise, again, from 2 days out to 1 day out, I'm going to pull back a little bit harder on the protein. Let's say for most individuals now, it's going to be anywhere from 100 grams to 150 grams scale weight per meal. And then the carbs and the fats, most often, again, if everything's trending right, are going to continue to go up in incremental amounts. Those amounts, from 2 days out might be somewhere in the realm of, I really try to look at food, not as a whole day. The final day for me is just literally meal by meal. So I'm not calculating numbers in terms of 6 meals. I'm saying, okay, I want this individual to start at 22 grams of fat per meal. I want their carbohydrates to be at 115, and I want their protein to be at 35. And then I'm just going to see meal by meal. And really, again, one of the first things that I said, guys, is eliminating variables. I personally like to eliminate even the sources of food the closer we get to stage. So if I give that person, let's say, for example, I give them olive oil, I give them ground beef, and I give them rice, and it's in the increments of 22 grams of fat, they're getting 35 grams of protein, and they're getting 110 grams of carbs. If I look at them after meal 1, they've improved from meal 1, I'm not going to scratch my head and be like, oh, what do I give them next? If everything's trending right, I'm literally going to give them the same meal. Or if I think they need to be a little bit fuller, or if they're a little too full, or maybe if the look didn't do what we wanted, I'm most often going to keep the same foods in, and I'm just going to toggle them up and down based off of the response. Again, that's my approach, and I think that approach for me works so well because I understand it, and I think it also eases the individual that you're coaching. because they can see, okay, this is a system. I'm getting better. I'm eating the same foods. We're toggling the amounts, and it just builds confidence. Because for a coach, one of the things that I think is most important 2 days out, 1 day out, is just to really instill and build confidence within your athletes. And a lot of that comes down to communication and how the process is being built. And a lot of that process being built is just simplifying it for them. They have so much on their plate. Their normal schedule's already kind of turned upside down. They're no longer at their home. They're in a hotel. They have athletes meeting. They have tanning. So the more simple, in my opinion, you can make this process and schedule for them, the better it's going to be. All right. So again, throughout that day, the closer we're getting to prejudging, the closer we're getting to stage, I might manipulate the water back more often than not. Again, if everything's trending right, I am bringing the food up slightly. One thing that I think is also super important for athletes too, to encourage them, is as the water comes down and the food's going up, you have less water to then process the food. So you really need to make sure that you're chewing well, you're chewing slow, you're aware of your midsection control as you're chewing these meals, and just making sure that everything's processing really well. Now, again, from a diuretic perspective, based off of that usage of 2 days out, I'm going to probably sprinkle a little bit more in if needed, but you really need to be aware of weight, and then also how the body's looking. So let's say, again, that 3 day out trend, and I'm not trying to be repetitive. I just want to make sure you guys fully understand. Let's say if they're clearing 7 pounds, and then 2 days out, they clear 9 pounds, but then their trend over day went from increasing 5, clearing 7, increasing 5, clearing 9. So now you're waking up in a deficit of anywhere from 2 to 4. That Friday, more often than not, I would say for most of my guys, their Friday weight doesn't change much. So if it doesn't change much, and the look is improving and the look's getting better, that would then tell me, okay, this person needs less diuretic, not more. Because if you know that you're getting a clearance in addition to of 2 to 4 pounds overnight, you don't want to then pull that person that's getting better, improving, ready, getting dry, to have them then wake up the morning of the show and they're now down 6 pounds because you continued on the same frequency of diuretic uses that you started at. So again, that's why I think the scale is so important. It should not trump your vision. It should not trump your experience in your eye, but something that you can just keep note of. So most often Friday night, to me, a super crucial part. Friday night or the night before a show is also a hard part, especially when we're looking at top Olympians top athletes like at the Olympia, because they have, the athletes meet and greet. They have a press conference that day. Typically after the meet and greet gets over at 9, they all have to go to tanning. So you lose a lot of that connection ability that you typically have at a normal qualifier going into the Olympia. So really being dialed in on these variables is super important, especially for those top guys. But going into those final few hours, again, for me, it's just about really topping off the look and getting their body in a position to hold that look, the look that you want overnight. Now, ideally, most cases, you want them a little bit sharper waking up the next morning. But if they're like bang on the money or just slightly a little too full, just through a good, consistent sleep cycle, that person's going to wake up in a really good spot. And then for me on show day, again, I bring the variables and I just bring them down even tighter. I reduce the protein even further. Most often, if it's a final day where they're going to have 2 to 3 meals pre-stage, protein is only in meal 1, and then I really go to more of a fat and carb-based model. And then again, as we're getting closer to stage time, the sodium is coming up. And that's really my process in full. And what I mean by sodium coming up, this isn't something that I overly have guys calculate, but I'm simple-minded. So let's say, for example, you're doing 3 shakes a meal, 4 shakes a meal. I might say, hey, let's bring that up to 6 shakes a meal, and then we'll see how the response there. And then, as that blood volume level of water is starting to go down through either pulling water, diuretic usage, whatever it might be, bringing the sodium in is just going to help solidify that look to keep the fullness due to the loss of water volume. And then post-prejudging for me is a time where it's just more so about really getting the body calm. Obviously you've had that anxiety, fear of the unknown. Did we do well? Did we not do well? Hopefully you did well. And then really, guys, you're going to see the body just progress so well because you've just dropped off a lot of stress and the unknown, as I just mentioned. It's not a pet peeve of mine, but I think it's funny, when so often man, he improved so much from some prejudging to finals. Well, you should, it's a safer environment. It's a less stress-free environment, especially if you did well. So then that afternoon between prejudging and finals for me is more so just about continuing what we did in the morning, what worked well in the morning, maybe putting a little bit of water back in, seeing if the athletes sweat on stage or they didn't sweat on stage. Ideally, most guys should not sweat on stage. From a metabolic perspective, you could also have somebody that's just so wound up and metabolizing food so well and their body is running hot that even though they're super dry, they might clear more water. So that might be an environment where you need to then put more water back in. But that's really in a nutshell. Hopefully you guys gain something from this, because that's really how I do my peak weeks. And I've just gotten better over time because I don't change my process. I know why I'm doing what I'm doing, and then I just pay attention to those small variables. And I think one of the main things for me that's helped me be so successful is I'm not looking at the food snapshot at a day at a time. I really just break it down a meal at a time, and it's simpler math. If you're looking at 135 grams of carbs for the day, if you're looking at it like that, that's a lot of numbers to calculate at once. But like I said, start at I'm going to give this athlete 17 grams of fat or 22 grams of fat. I'm going to give them 85 grams of carbs. I'm going to give them 35 grams of protein, and then just wait and see how they respond. And then just continue to make those changes meal by meal, one at a time. And I really think over time, through experience, you're just going to be so pleased with how you're learning the body's response through the day, rather than overcomplicating it and trying to deliver this elaborate plan all at once.
What's the most common mistake you see coaches make peaking athletes?
I think the most common mistake is just looking for a week of magic and pulling variables into play that don't need to be there. And guys, I will be the first to say, you can experience a tremendous amount of change, positive or negative, based off of what you do during the final week. So in a way, I don't want it to be undermined that you can produce a lot of magic the final week. I will talk very openly about, Sean and I's process. We go through a lot of change the final few weeks. I would say, in my opinion, he's one of the athletes that I've worked with that experiences the most amount of change that final week. And we've just done this process so many times. And, I even mentioned it, I was on a podcast this week. The IFBB judges, at the Olympia this past year, they came up to us backstage and like, guys, you literally nailed it 7 times in a row. You didn't nail it this time, So there's things that still can go wrong, but I don't want to undermine the value of a properly done peak week. But I still think whether you're peaking yourself, whether you're working with a coach, that things should be logical and they should make sense. And if you're changing so many variables at one time, it might work, but are you able to actually pinpoint why it works, why it might not work, what actually worked? And that's why I like to go one variable at a time, because then I can pinpoint okay, this is where we started to go south and I just changed this, but if you've changed water, if you've added diuretics, if you've thrown in a bunch of food and you've pulled back on training all at the same time, well, then you don't really know what is helping, what's hurting, all those things that I think should be so closely monitored.
Tips for dealing with joint pain during peak week.
Okay, so joint pain, that's going to come down to just low levels of body fat. It could come down to lower levels of estrogen. Again, to me, from a champion mentality, joint pain should be secondary the final week to cosmetic. So really, I think, again, it could also be you needing to reduce inflammation, which means pulling back on training. And I didn't really overly touch on this, but I do think it's super important to keep your body in rhythm. But when I say pulling back on training, I just mean not going above and beyond failure. I think still driving that stimulus to a near failure set point is beneficial. Also to reducing the amount of load under eccentric. So moving faster under control through your eccentrics, because eccentric training is where the most amount of damage and breakdown occurs. And then just contracting hard, hard contractions, not over accentuating the eccentric component, and, focusing on that is a big part, but that, not overly straining during training sessions, not doing joint traumatic movements, reducing cardio, those things can all benefit your joints as well.
Tips for getting a good pump backstage.
Okay. A good pump backstage. Great question. What I like to do is I think, oftentimes, obviously backstage, what I would encourage you to do is to get backstage early and be aware of the environment. And what I mean by being aware of the environment is, how are the expediters? How is their mentality? Do they have things under control? Or do they seem a little frantic? Is the rate of which that they're lining up athletes, is it super early? Are the athletes getting glazed and lining up early? Are they getting glazed and lining up late? These things should all play into how you're being aware of when should you start to pump up. And for a pump up, where I think a lot of people go wrong is they get backstage, they start to throw some food in, food that might not be digested well, and then they just go crazy doing these circuits, or they don't stop moving for a long time. And for a lot of us, if we're honest with ourselves, that's not how we train. So what I would rather do is like have a slow and steady buildup, just like you do during training. So what does that mean? Like do a set of push-ups, stand up for a minute, like do some just like muscle contractions, do a set of lateral raises, get your heart rate back down. I think a lot of athletes too, their adrenaline is going so much, and by the time they get on stage, that's part of the reason why they're sweating, is because they're dehydrated, their adrenaline's cranking. They just did a 30-minute workout backstage. They didn't do any rest in between, even though the whole time training for the prep, they never did a circuit like that. So like make things, again, from a variable standpoint, don't change the variables of how you approach the entire process, do some push-ups. A lot of what I encourage too is just hard muscle contractions while standing in line. Hit your mandatory poses, hit your front relaxed, visualize yourself on stage, contract your chest hard. When you hit your back, contract your back, things like that to me are all super important, but also just to not like fully blow your load backstage, like going gangbusters just because somebody else is. And then by the time you get on stage, like you're just done, so that's super important.
Are there any foods that are a must during peak week?
There are no foods that are a must, but I think that you should really pay attention to foods that digest well for you, that don't cause gas, bloating, distension. And there's several things. Again, I reduce those variables down. I'm a big proponent of rice. I'm a big proponent of meat and the mineral content that you get from meat. Fats, I like to really make sure that the person's digesting them well and that it's not causing gas. For example, I love avocados. Avocados for some cause gas, especially when it's consumed. You have to also be conscious of the way that I do it, like food consumed over and over and over again. So you want to find the best sources that allocate for that person to have a healthy digestion system, to keep their bowels moving, things of that nature going into the final few hours.
How often should somebody be posing during peak week?
Posing during peak week. I think this is a great question. One thing that you often hear a lot on stage is, oh, look, that person's fading on stage. That person's getting harder on stage. That can just kind of sometimes be the environment. That can also, again, be their adrenaline. But I think a lot of times, if you actively pose in between each meal, you're going to get a better meal by meal response of how your body is utilizing those carbohydrates. So typically what happens, I think, is if somebody fades on stage, they might be over glycogen compensated, overfilled, and they didn't mobilize that food enough. And so they start to mobilize it on stage. And then that's when it starts to spill from intracellular to extracellular. When they say somebody's getting better on stage, then I would say that they had the food readily available to use, but they didn't contract and put it into the muscle hard enough. So it's taking some extra contraction on stage to get that look that they need. So I think if you just do a simple 2 to 3 rounds, like 60 to 90 minutes after every meal, especially the day before, especially as you're loading the food, paying attention to how your stomach's digesting and absorbing it, as well as how your muscular contractions are improving throughout the day, that's a very valuable thing to make sure that you peak on stage and you're able to actually hold that peak on stage. All right, guys. So this, in not my opinion, but like I think this kind of wraps up a lot of the bodybuilding Q&A series. Obviously, I'm more than happy to do this for you guys and continue to do this. It's just that we need direction. I think I've really hit on like a lot of the key topics. So if you guys want to put feedback in here, if you want me to go a different direction, if you want me to kind of spin in a different way, I'm happy to continue to do this. I just want to continue to provide value and also make sure that I'm just not repeating the same things over and over again. But this has been super fun for me, and as I said, when we started this, there's no agenda for me in this at all. This isn't to like build my own coaching. I just wanted to give you guys, as people that believe in our brand, I wanted to give you guys a valuable resource, a trusted resource, somebody that you can come to and know that you're getting sound information from, so that's really all this has been about. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. Again, in the comments, if you want to say, hey, Matt, hey, Mook, like we'd love to see you go this direction. As long as it makes sense, I'm more than happy to continue to do this. Again, this just comes down to providing value, within our brand and just showing appreciation for the experience and knowledge that I've gained over time and just sharing that with you guys. So thanks again. Would love to hear your feedback on this and just what you guys would like to see next, and we'll go from there.